I'm wrong, you're wrong, he's wrong, she's wrong, they're wrong, we're wrong. You're wrong, I am wrong. We are wrong. Seriously wrong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Seriously Wrong podcast. I am your co-host, Shawn, joined today by Eleanor Finley, author of the book Practicing Social Ecology. Eleanor's a researcher, writer, and activist who previously contributed to our three-part social ecology series on Seriously Wrong. We have been interested in the subject of social ecology for some time now on the show, sort of started playing with the ideas in maybe 2015 or 2016. And by 2018, 2019, I became pretty convinced that there's some specific value within the social ecological tradition, the social ecological tradition of a explicitly utopian politics that is critical of class society and hierarchy, that aims to create a democratic and ecological society where people's basic needs are met, where hierarchy and bosshood is eroded, and where property relations are renewed in the direction of usufructian sharing based on use and need rather than hoarding and private property and so on. And also, there's layers to what I really like about social ecology, and also this idea of a class-oriented political movement, a revolutionary movement, an anti-capitalist revolutionary movement that aims to bring human society and the natural world into, for lack of a better word, harmony, living within the natural world in a way that respects it and that also values, human agency, freedom, and with that values technology and values. There's all these interesting things about social ecology to me. And practicing social ecology, it's intended to be sort of a readable intro to social ecological ideas. Social ecological ideas are kind of notoriously hard to summarize quickly. And a lot of the canon of Bookchin and other writers contains dated references, or it's inaccessible the way that a lot of political theory is. So I thought this was a really, really great intervention, really fun book. Enjoyed reading it. So really glad to have you here this week, Eleanor. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be back.
So yeah, I thought here at the top, it might be good to sort of summarize the big ideas of social ecology. So I touched on a lot of elements of it there. One of the big ideas, too, is that the ecological crisis is actually a social crisis. It's human relations that cause the ecological crisis. That's another kind of key social ecology meme. Yeah, what else would you say is essential to understanding the social ecological perspective and its value?
Yeah, so like you said, social ecology is really difficult or even impossible to summarize briefly. And this question of what is social ecology absorbed me a great deal when writing this book. And what I think I discovered is that there are many different ways of answering this question of what is social ecology, or sort of as you put it, like what are the key ideas? One way of answering this question of what is social ecology is to say it is a body of revolutionary philosophy that was pioneered in the mid 20th century, the late 20th century, by a thinker named Murray Bookchin, who came from a Marxist background, and like many astute Marxists in the mid-century, started to feel dissatisfied with the trajectory of the socialist movement and critique the problem of authoritarianism in what became Marxist-Leninism or state socialism. So Murray Bookchin grew up in the Bronx in New York City I think he was born in the 1920s. And by the 1950s, joined a group of thinkers who were tackling this problem of authoritarianism and social movements. So social ecology is really his way of summarizing the idea that the revolutionary dialectic that we're all wrapped up in and implicated by is one pertaining to not just the problem of capitalism, but to hierarchy in general. and that this historical problem that we're confronting right now as a species isn't just the globalization of capitalism, but the globalization of hierarchical relationships. The notion of relationships is central to why Bookchin selected ecology as a perspective and a methodology for these views. Ecology is the science of relationships in nature. So a conventional ecologist is looking at the relationships between species in natural ecosystems. And social ecology is a way to talk about social relationships between people. What are the nature of those relationships? And what is, crucially, our relationship to the natural world? So social ecology, in contrast to, say, Marx's political economy, is concerned with the nature of social relationships and whether or not those relationships are mutualistic or if they're oppressive, if there's autonomy in those relationships or care, as opposed to violence or silencing. So this question of hierarchy is very central to social ecology. So there's many different ways of defining social ecology. And I mentioned this body of revolutionary work closely associated with Murray Bookchin, but we can also define social ecology as something that is inclusive of Bookchin's work, but also expansive beyond just his work and brings in other thinkers. At the Institute for Social Ecology, for example, up in Vermont, where I was educated in these ideas, we can think of social ecology as expansive and inclusive of the Kurdish revolutionary movement and the really important contributions Kurdish revolutionaries have made to an understanding of the world that sees democracy and ecology as inherently connected. So something I talk about at length in the book is this notion of a movement of movements. And as I reflected on this question of like, well, what is social ecology? Is it just Bookchin's work? Is it many people's work? Is everybody who comes after Bookchin just pilfering his ideas? I really came to believe that what we mean by social ecology is a transformation in consciousness to, again, recognizing the very close relationship between political liberation and ecological liberation, between relationships of non-hierarchy in social systems, so autonomy, mutualism, horizontalism, friendship among people, and societies that are able to live in harmony with the natural world. And that movement of movements is something that I think we can see in many different places, that there's a growing ecological consciousness globally that is recognizing not just the destructive impacts of capitalism on the natural world, although that is also very much a part of it, but also, again, this kind of potential for human beings to have a very different approach to life than the one we've been accustomed to, certainly since the Industrial Revolution, one might say, since the solidifying of capitalism in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, or we might even look even farther back into our history at the development of the state and patriarchy into societies that are warfare-based and colonial. Social ecology is really a transformation in human consciousness to recognize that these hierarchical and violent institutions are not serving us, and that if we want to survive as a species, we need to radically democratize the way that we live, our economies, our communities, and to do so in a way that's really protecting values of social justice. So I'll maybe leave it there. There's a lot more to get into. Maybe I can offer that in the book, I break down social ecology into 4 sort of interrelated principles, while also trying to maintain the overall dialectical character of social ecology. And that dialectical character is what trips a lot of people up. And understandably so, we're not accustomed to thinking in dialectical ways, or at least we don't think that we are. In fact, what dialectical really means is just developmental or organic. So social ecology is a dialectical philosophy in the sense that we're looking at the unfolding of ideas and the cumulative development of social systems and ecological systems. And we're looking at tendencies over history. So in Bookchin's work, he looks at the tendency for mutualism, interdependence, and consciousness in natural evolution. And he argues that social evolution or society is an extension of those tendencies, that human beings are really this remarkable achievement of natural evolution.
That was one of the things that really pulled me into social ecology, as I recall, is kind of the refutation of the hierarchical naturalism of something like evolutionary psychology, or these kinds of like pseudo-scientific ideas of like capitalism and the human way of life as being this thing that's found in nature, that when a boss fires an employee to make profits for shareholders and they're going to render them, potentially needing to move or be homeless or harm their family and so on, that is just a natural extension of the same territorial ambitions that chimpanzees have, that they might, fight over or something like that. And I found really compelling within the social ecological ideas of like, no, if we look at nature, a lot of things happen in nature. Like, yes, there is conflict sometimes, or there's status seeking among certain animals, but also the overall picture of nature is actually that it's a very complementary place, that it's a place where different animals and plants within an ecosystem form a kind of holistic unity and diversity, that they all benefit from each other's presence. Even predator-prey relationships are balanced in a way that they both benefit by these steady state kind of balance and so on. Our bodies are like, the microbes in our bodies are essential to our functioning, where we are ourselves confederations of cooperation, or just not even explicit cooperation necessarily, but emergent cooperation, that there's this natural flow to the world that isn't about bosses ordering people around, or that isn't about hoarding, excluding others, a war of all against all, and so on. So just thinking back on, you asked before we recorded of like, why social ecology for me? How did I start thinking this was important? And I think that was one of the pieces for me, is that I always found those ideas like pretty repulsive and used in ways that I just didn't think were, apart from having political disagreements, I just thought it was theoretically wrong. And social ecology was threading together these different things that I cared about, democracy, ecology, and so on. And then also had this view of the natural world as well, as a place that has, like, the politics of the natural world are not dismal, economic, exclusionary, and so on. The politics of the natural world is actually pretty abundant, mutualistic, and so on. So that was like, I think that was a turning point for me, and like why I zoned in on social ecology in particular.
Right. And it's funny, any gardener can tell you that, right? That collaboration and diversity are really the key principles to maintaining life itself. And it is extremely telling that our current society that's predicated on predation, accumulation, individualism, competition, and a general lack of care for other people also perceives nature as, like you said, incredibly violent, competitive, uncaring. And so this is one of the crucial points that Bookchin was making, is that our perception of nature, our interpretation of nature is in fact very closely related to our perceptions of society. And the capitalist domination-based society that we live in perceives nature, or is based on a nature philosophy that is, in a very true sense, incompatible with life. The capitalist cosmology that sees Earth as endlessly exploitable, that perceives virtually all life on Earth as a resource or a potential resource or an obstacle to extraction, is incompatible with an ecosystem that has been developing over the course of billions of years. So Bookchin himself defined social ecology as, I think he put it, that the recognition that the notion of dominating nature stems from the very real domination of people. Or I think, he has this nice way of putting it. He says the notion of man dominating nature stems from the real domination of Earth by humans, which is to say that the idea of dominating nature really is a fantasy. And that fantasy is rooted in a social system that has domination at its core. And I think when you read Bookchin, these notions can seem abstract, but we can really concretize them just by looking at someone like Elon Musk, who believes that we can, or a certain group can fly to Mars, that there's a special, superior class of people who, by innate ability, can transcend their position as wishy, biological, ordinary humans and upload their consciousness to the cloud, for example, right? Like, this is what they believe. And they believe that nature can be manipulated and that we can simply just create techno fixes that will solve the climate crisis or protect the billionaire class. They believe this. They believe that they can get out of the matrix of biology that binds us all together. And their perception of nature is a very grim place. And conversely, Indigenous communities that have thrived in harmonious relationships with the natural world often have a very respectful and reverential concept of nature. They might not even have a concept of nature at all, right? There just simply is life, and there's various beings in life. And there is no conceptual divide between society and nature. The divide between society and nature is, in fact, that's a Western construction. So this question of our interpretation of nature and natural evolution and our perception of society and social evolution, these sound like very academic, abstract ideas, but in fact, they really strike at the core of the civilizational crisis that we're in today. That's also a crisis of political imagination.
Yeah, the concept of dominating nature, like, you might not encounter it that much in your day-to-day life. People be like, I'm going to go dominate nature. But like everything around us that we see, the way that society is built on the land, the way that cities interact with riverways and oceans, the way that the existence of cruise ships and so on, it's all based on this kind of idea that whatever's there is there for the taking, as long as no one else is going to fight you for it. And you can pollute on your own land because it's your land. You can pollute in your own rivers because it's your rivers, or that the rivers, the land, the resources are all subordinate to the desires of states and multinational corporations to extract resources from the earth, use it to enrich themselves and people connected to them, without any measuring of the externalities or the long-term effects, the warming of the earth, the depletion of fish stocks, the depletion of non-renewable resources and things like that. Like, the underlying implicit thought there is that there's no relationality between us and the world other than extraction, self-benefit, and the conflict over nature is a conflict between people. Who has the claim to the river? Who has the claim to the land? Yeah, I get what you mean in that it almost sounds academic, or if you're not thinking through what it means to, I could imagine someone thinking like, well, no one's walking around being like, time to go dominate nature.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, sometimes like people are, but it's also like this undergirding concept that all these other things sit on top of, like the way that we act sits on top of, and the kind of hierarchical naturalism of your Elon Musk, Silicon Valley, transcend nature types as well. It's all based on this kind of spending through an inheritance as if it's a renewable source of income, the natural world. We only have so much of it. And also we are in relationship with it. Like, there's this concept you mentioned in the book, and I think comes from Bookchin, it's the eco-community concept, which is like it's another way of talking about ecosystems, but in a sense of like relationality. So it could be relationality between humans and nature, but it could also be relations between different animals and plants within an ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's interesting about that to me, I guess.
Before we move off of that that question of perceptions of nature, I think it's also worth noting that the right are very quick to appeal to human nature to explain their crimes, right? And this is where a feminist perspective is really crucial, because they are very quick to appeal to the notion that it is the nature of men to dominate, to be violent, to be unempathetic, and it is the nature of women to nurture, to stay home, to be caring, to raise children. And they appeal to nature in their racism as well. You know, they don't think of it in these terms. I agree with you that they're not saying it outright, you know, that they see it as human nature, that humans are divided into these various subspecies where some are superior and inferior. But they do believe this, and they see themselves as superior and in racialized and gendered ways. And that, I think, is part and parcel to the disregard for the natural world that you described, right? Like the assumption that the natural world is just disposable and you don't even have to think about it, right? That's sort of what comes to mind in that domination mentality. But I think we, even as well-meaning people, are conditioned this way as well, right? Like we throw out how many tons of garbage every year, just one person. And the invisibility of the impacts of our day-to-day lives is a part of that system of domination. And I think it's crucial to remember that in some ways these are ways of thinking, but these are ways of thinking that are engendered by institutions. So the question of institutions is also really crucial for social ecology. Something we haven't touched on yet is the notion of direct democracy and the political institutions that are capable of facilitating a ecological society. These are really sort of at the heart of social ecology, certainly in its conception. As a social movement, it's moved in a lot of different directions. And I know before our recording, you and I were talking about some of that, like the concerns that come from social movements. Again, I come back to this question of what is social ecology, and something that I say in my book is that social ecology is not just a set of ideas, it's also a social movement. It's a tradition of praxis. And I called the book Practicing Social Ecology because I wanted to foreground to people that this isn't just pie in the sky ecological philosophy or capitalist or critical theory. This is really a vision praxis that is trying to engender a life-affirming world. That term vision praxis comes from Arturo Escobar. He's an anthropologist. Actually, he was Haya Heller's dissertation supervisor. So he's an anthropologist who's very friendly to social ecology and draws on social ecological perspectives quite a lot. So it's important to remember that social ecology has a practical dimension as well. And this is, even as a theory, has been developed through struggle and the history of left movements.
It's one of the cool things about social ecology is how it kind of pulls together these threads in different directions, and it's got a really strong analysis and theory behind it, but it also advocates for a particular set of actions. Like the opposition to hierarchy with it contains a positive platform as well, hierarchy in the sense of command and control under the threat of punishment in particular, not hierarchy as in I like yellow more than blue,
right.
Which is, there's like a lot of definition wobble around that.
Yeah, people get confused about that distinction.
But more particularly bosshood, someone being a boss of another person is, Dan Chodakov got that phrase stuck in my head of command and control under the threat of punishment.
Yeah.
So with that, there's a positive platform. The positive platform is relationships of complementarity, that is recognizing differences among people as being a generative whole, rather than saying like, this is the boss and everyone's subordinate. It's like everyone has different things to bring, and then you can have something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. It also comes with like the irreducible minimum, the idea of like a level that in a society no one should fall below. You shouldn't be completely deprived of things if you don't do work. We shouldn't have a system of coerced labor where your housing, your food, and so on is not going to be taken care of at least a basic level. That also relates to an opposition to bosshood. And then also horizontal direct democracy that is local and confederated, all those ideas are threaded philosophically through the opposition to bosshood, in that it's horizontal and that no one's above or below each other. It's democratic and that it's participatory and group. It's based in participatory groups rather than small amounts of people commanding others. But then it's also local in the sense, in part, and maybe you could express more of where this comes from, but my interpretation is that it's local because those are the people, like the people who are around you are the people that you can have real relationships with, and to have a society based on, and this is theorized in a sort of a pre-internet era as well, right? That this face-to-face democracy of local communities prevents rule from outside of the locality. And then by confederating, you can have direct democracy and then another layer of direct democracy. If you confederate, I can't remember if it's like in groups of 30, if you confederate up, it takes less than 7 layers to confederate the entire planet into a global confederated direct democracy.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't seen someone crunch the numbers. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's something like that. We did crunch the numbers once, and it was impressive how few layers and how small the group could be in achieving that. So yeah, I feel like that's appealing. Like when I talk to people about social ecology stuff, generally people are like, yeah, I like democracy. Yeah, I don't like bosses. I'd prefer an alternative. I like the ecology. I see how these things are related. But kind of, I guess the main stumbling block, or the main thing that I think people have a little bit of trouble imagining direct democracy, especially if they haven't participated in some version of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like even just imagining the complexity of a working direct democracy I also find that challenging, and imagining the path from here to there. There's a lot of variables. It's very complex, and poorly run direct democracy can be very unpleasant. I mean, so can poorly run authoritarianism, and this kind of relates overall broader to the sort of, you could call it the pragmatic critique of social ecology, which is that all sounds nice,
Mm-hmm.
but how do you do it? How do we enact that in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I like in the book, along that theme of like practicing and the practical side, you give some even suggestions for places where people can look into types of rules of order and like how these assemblies work and stuff like that. So I was curious to have you explain a bit in helping people to understand what would it be like to be in a directly democratic society that is horizontal, non-hierarchical, and so on. Like, what would that experience be like?
Yeah. Quickly, I want to tie up that thread about the continuity between ecological principles and then bringing that into the domain of the political, right? Because again, this sort of speaks to the dialectical nature of social ecology. What do we mean by that? And so social ecology really considers deeply democratic, confederated political structures as maintaining the tendencies within the natural world for independence, complementarity, as you mentioned, mutualism, diversity. And so what that means is we're looking at a very different way of even conceiving of institutions, right? Like today we have a very mechanistic idea of political institutions or just of politics in general. Mechanistic meaning that you can just copy and paste it into different locales and it looks the same or should function the same, that a parliament is effectively the same anywhere you go. And we see them as mechanistic in that if you just simply enact these certain procedures, you'll get an outcome, right? It's literally mechanistic in the sense of like you have inputs and outputs. And we conceive of democracy in this way. And social ecology is calling for a very different kind of democracy. And in that kind of democracy, people are valuable for the unique perspectives that they bring. As you mentioned, we're thinking in terms of the lived scale of life. So we're looking at communities that are dealing with each other on a day-to-day basis. So the level of neighborhoods, towns, city squares, wards, and really considering how we live our day-to-day lives with our neighbors. And again, it feels abstract because, particularly in the United States, because we commute to our jobs. We have a car-dependent culture that alienates people over great distances. So a lot of social ecology is interested in closing some of those gaps and really profoundly decentralizing our day-to-day lives, the pathways of production. And these are, of course, ecological principles as well, right? Like the degrowth movement is very eloquent in how it puts forward this argument that we really have to dramatically change our methods of production and consumption in order to sustain life on this planet. But coming back to your question of what would it look like to actually live in this kind of democracy, and like you said, it's very kind of difficult to conceive. So one is that it is in some ways impossible to just project as a blueprint because it requires the creative participation of the people who are in that community. And when we actualize the principle of diversity, what that means is a diversity of procedures, a diversity of styles, a diversity of tone in the political sphere, in the political world. Something I encountered in my research as an anthropologist is just how pervasive the assumption is that Indigenous people don't have politics, right? Indigenous people in a Western colonized conceptual framework are understood as really not having politics. And I think that's because their style of politics is outside of the Western colonized capitalist conceptual vocabulary of what politics can even be and mean. And Indigenous political systems are often, again, face to face. They're constructed by the people who are living in that society. So not necessarily beholden to law, or law is conceived in a very, very different way. It's much more creative, much more participatory. Indigenous political systems are also very often enmeshed with cosmological beliefs and appeals to a sense of the sacred, whereas we have, again, a binary between what we see as earthly or human concerns and spiritual concerns. We see politics as a really kind of cynical place, not an idealistic place. None of this is really answering your question about what it would mean to, live in this kind of society. But I think the point that I want to make is that it requires many different kinds of transformation happening simultaneously. An instant direct democracy in the world that we currently exist in is not really the social ecological democracy that social ecology calls for. We're really talking about a holistic set of transformations that are taking place in the economy, again, and how people live. But I think we can get a taste for these kinds of politics through social movements, which I know many of us who are involved in this perspective have, helped organize. And on that level, what does it look like to engage with these kinds of politics? It means talking to your neighbors. It means dealing with people who see the world very differently than you do. In some ways, it means abandoning our commitment to party politics. The current political landscape is really to see people group according to their opinions, right? It's like we have the right, we have the left, we have Republicans, Democrats, radicals, but even radical circles, we flock together in these little ideological camps and don't really have a lot of interaction with people who think differently than us and see the world differently than us. So a radically democratic political movement demands that we are entering into deliberative spaces, assemblies or otherwise, with our neighbors. And our neighbors might have really different political views, cultural views, spiritual views than we do. And that creates a whole another host of problems. I think this relates back to this question of like the pragmatic critique of social ecology, is that assemblies are too complicated and difficult, that people fight with each other. And I think that question of complexity will stick with us, certainly throughout our lifetimes. But also, I think a lot of what people are interpreting as complexity is actually a problem of putting the cart before the horse, meaning that we're organizing assemblies and expecting them to make binding, important community decisions. And we're expecting communities to arrive at what we see as the right decision or ethical decision without really knowing each other or sharing a sense of community fabric. So to me, this strikes at the question of what do we mean by democracy? And is democracy just a set of deliberative procedures? This is the question that really sticks with me right now and absorbs a lot of my current writing, because I think I've arrived to a place where I'm starting to understand that democracy, real democracy, involves far more than just deliberative procedures. And maybe a problematic or Western colonized sort of and masculinist, all the isms that a lot of social ecology, social ecological writing reproduces, is the idea that democracy is really just a deliberative process. It's just people coming together to make decisions. I'm starting to think that real democracy is the whole process of people learning to live together, learning to value one another, and have a baseline of moral principles. Because it's true, we might disagree on a lot of things, but we can't disagree on everyone's humanity, for example. We can't disagree about a principle of non-hierarchy. We have to have a principle of non-hierarchy and share that universally. We can't disagree on some of the basic facts of science. If we're arriving with conspiracy theories and appeals to authoritarians, or there's a lot of wacky ideas out there, and snapping your fingers and having a neighborhood come together and just sort of throw all of those ideas into a pot, that's not really democracy, or it's woefully insufficient. So I think the community building, the rehabilitation of neighborhoods and civic life is also really critical to this process. So to answer your question of what would this world look like, I think this world would look like a lot more efforts to simply be around one another. There would be a conscious effort to combat isolation and alienation that really dominates our lives under capitalism.
It reminds me, one of the things I was thinking about when going through your book is the kind of like what the role of, it relates to what you're saying about almost like rote procedural idea of democracy versus the integrated, like, and procedures are important, and you need to have, you need to proceed according to some principle, and according to maybe you have a charter or constitution that outlines values and for any given one, and you have what is an appropriate way to advance an idea, or inappropriate or not to argue with an idea or speak together. But the thing I was thinking about is like and maybe it's under theorized, maybe I haven't read it, or maybe it's under theorized in this space, is kind of like the convivial nature of democracy. So I remember Bookchin writing about revolutionary education, like the Revolutionary Project is an educational project, democracy. And it seems to me that that's like, for a long time, I felt like that's a key part of a direct democracy, is like, how do people get access to information? How is there spaces to think through things together, to learn in public, and culturally be comfortable with not knowing or recognizing your own limits? Like, these are some of the complex things that emerge in attempts at direct democracy, or attempts at even like Robert's Rules of Order type meetings, where there's like posturing with this implicit bosshood of like needing to prove yourself and things like that, all this like weird cultural stuff to address to make it work. But the other thing is the convivial, the social parties, joint dinners, like socialization with each other. I'm becoming increasingly convinced is core to a revolutionary project, that like it almost seems like something maybe you should do first. Like it almost seems like just having less political or slightly political opportunities to create social relationships and group social relationships that aren't about, oh, do we support this, or do we support about this, or I'm for this, I'm against this, and we're going to argue, like all that stuff that comes out, those sort of votes where voting creates losers and resentments. And if you're not on a human level, it's easy to get resentful or to project things onto people, or have a little enemy in your mind with someone who might not even realize that you've made them an object of resentment in the context of attempts at democracy. And I wanted to ask about that. It is the convivial, the party socialist, not political parties, but like hanging out, barbecues, picnics, all that kind of stuff. Is that something that has a place within the social ecological tradition as it currently exists, that I'm missing? Or is that something that I guess needs to be developed to flesh out? Because it seems like there's value-based connections, obviously, to a lot of these ideas, but I can't remember reading anything about it from social ecology thinkers in particular.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of really great literature and discussion around this exists in feminist literature and feminist critiques of masculinist understandings of democracy, particularly around the question of our assumption that democracy, even direct democracy, is necessarily antagonistic and oppositional, right? Like you mentioned, that there's always, like that there's winners and losers, this notion that a democratic discussion is a zero-sum game, that someone's win is another's loss, and your proposal either passes or it doesn't, right? Consensus politics or consensus decision-making processes are meant to really combat this and encourage a generative idea of democracy, right? That we're solving problems together. We're trying to address everyone's needs, everyone's concerns, and ultimately come up with something that we can all live with. And I very much believe that consensus is not going to be possible for everyone at all times all over the world, or even at a local level, but the principle holds that it's a big perspective shift to go from a competition between opposing forces to collaborators who are really coming to each other from a sense of care. Regarding some of the other skills and capacities and qualities that you mentioned under the notion of sort of conviviality, I think that they're indispensable. And from my own traveling and research, to me, it seems that the movements that really have traction as revolutions, often even if they're understanding themselves as socialist revolutions, even if they're even, kind of top down, or what we now see as top down, like a Russian revolution, right? That those actually were using assemblies, and that actually, in fact, the communal joy that people experience together is really indispensable. And they are throwing parties, really. But last bit was a little bit ranty. But in the tradition of social ecology, I think today we're at a low point of having fun with each other. And in the 1960s, Murray wrote about post-scarcity anarchism and the politics of joy that went along with the counterculture movement in the 1960s and 70s, which he saw as extremely revolutionary. I think actually a lot of Murray's most potent and inspired material has to do with his interpretation of the counterculture movements in the 1960s.
Yeah, I love that early Bookchin stuff around post-scarcity anarchism. And it relates to the caricature of Bookchin idea that Price talks about in the book and stuff as this curmudgeon. Mm-hmm. It's like you have this really vibrant kind of hippie-coded, the post-scarcity anarchist era. Also in the prose, there's something really delightful about the prose from that era as being kind of confrontational in a Bugs Bunny-like way. And Listen Marxist also has that, Bugs Bunny's on the cover of Listen Marxist, famously, the pamphlet. And the development of his ideas over time, there's value in, some people argue early Bookchin, late Bookchin in a contest for superiority or something like that. But I feel like there's value in both eras, but the early era has a lot more of that convivial, social, playful vibe. And then in his later writing, he's becoming more focused on this kind of more rigid, this is the truth mode of Bookchin writing over time. And there's some, you don't have time to go into all the history of all the beefs and so on of how structurally he got to that point. But you mentioning the post-scarcity anarchist era has this really fun, vibrant, almost unhingedness to it at times that I really delight in. Mm-hmm. And then over time, it becomes a little more closed off, rigid, and formal in the sense that we're kind of criticizing and thinking of direct democracy as a set of procedures. It was like he became increasingly creating this utopia of procedures and values and how they interlock. And there's a lot of value in it, but there's some unhinged spark when he's talking about people growing out their hair and quitting their jobs as having a revolutionary potential and stuff like that. And that era, I really appreciate that about it and think that would be good to retain that feeling.
Yeah, I think in some ways we're in a moment of reaction to that. And I think people tend to think of that shift in his work as really a personal shift and a personal evolution. And, I'm sure he evolved as a person, but I think it's maybe more fruitful to think about it as being in relation to two different periods of history. And what is so important about his latter work is the development of the notion of institutions. I mean, he's really, in the 80s and the 90s, were very, very, very few people who were writing about what institutional forms opposition to capitalism could take. I mean, there's like 3 or 4 that, like, I know there's like, Cornelius Castoriadis, C.L.R. James, folks like Hannah Arendt kicking around. So he was, I think, really important for keeping alive this notion that we should have institutional forms to hold on to that are also not parties. What is the institutional form that's going to replace the authoritarian Marxist-Leninist vanguard party? Are we just going to float around in affinity groups? So his insistence on assemblies and confederations and the municipality, the revolutionary potential of the municipality through he has this great phrase to describe libertarian municipalism. I think he said an organized political tendency. His insistence on an organized political tendency towards certain kinds of institutions, I think that was like a world historic contribution. At the same time, the things he was thinking about in the 60s, meaning like the ethos of a revolutionary movement, breaking away from what at that time were these kinds of older, there was an entrenched bureaucracy that was equally important. And today, I think we're in a place of having to recover just the notion of a collectivity at all. And these psychological questions have become incredibly urgent. So in some ways, it's like we can look to him for some answers, or, I think we can like consult with him. And particularly that point around institutions is really crucial. But this question of what are the kinds of people who can inhabit a democratic society and how can we become those kinds of people is really, really at the forefront. And I want to quickly go back to your question about the parties, the potlucks, the having fun with each other. That aspect of a democratic revolutionary movement is absolutely indispensable, and we've been overlooking it. And that aspect has to not just come from subcultures, but from communities themselves. So in the Kurdish movement, people spend a great amount of their time singing, dancing, writing poetry, sewing clothing, engaged in handicrafts, cooking, hanging out together. People hang out a lot and they talk and they read. At least that's my experience. It's been a number of years now since I've spent real concerted time among Kurdish activists. And I was primarily in Western Europe. But that, to me, really revolutionized my thinking, because when I first was engaged in dialogue with the Kurdish movement, I thought that what set them aside and made them so successful was surely they must have discovered the right procedure. Surely they discovered the formula of we have 100 people here and, 150 people over here. And then once you've a certain number of assemblies, then you can...
Here's the process for amending amendments.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the more I interacted with people, the clearer it became that in some ways, a lot of those procedures are just as messy as what we have. Procedures are really important, but what's actually more important is, are people going to follow through with what they say? If you make a decision together, okay, great. But what really matters is if they're going to follow through with that decision, if we're going to hold to that decision, if we're going to respect a decision, whether or not we like it, or if we say we're going to do something, we say we're going to organize something, or say we're going to prioritize something, are we actually going to follow through and do it? And what I came to, I think, really discover for myself personally was that I had been very narrowly focused, again, on these procedures. And what really was bringing the movement together is the singing, is the dancing, is the spending time together, just literally just existing in the same space. In Europe, they have these community centers all over the place. And some people will spend 5 days, 6 days a week there, just hanging out. And that sense of togetherness that is, again, not for any particular purpose, but just to be there and to be in other people's presence. It's a very different mentality to what even, really radical leftists in the West have. So I think it's a question of function and form, right? We have the form of the assembly. And again, Bookchin was like really obviously incredibly prescient and brilliant in thinking about that form. But then what is the function? What's the point of all of it? And the point of all of it is to have and maintain a collective life and, a collective experience and sense of identity. So a lot of that, I think, needs to be shored up also because that's what makes it worthwhile and enjoyable to be a part of a revolutionary movement. Anyone can tell you, like, these are challenging things to be a part of. No one pays you. If you live a life that's committed to revolutionary politics, you're going to be broke. You're going to struggle. You're going to be frustrated a lot. So why do it? You do it for the love of other people. And when we add things like music, community, food, joy, suddenly the why, there's a lot more to it. So I think that we should be thinking in terms of like block parties and community potlucks and listening sessions. And we should really be thinking about how to create multicultural and multiracial alliances in cities, as opposed to like, oh, we're going to go over here and have this deliberative assembly, but that assembly is only, middle-class white people. Is that democracy? Not really. What really is democracy is once we start having that diversity where we're coming together as whole communities because we actually give a shit about each other and we see each other and we show up for things. I'm kind of ranting about this because I think it's a really crucial point, and I think it may help us get out of our current fascist situation in the US. Like, for example, I really see a ton of revolutionary potential in the salsa community or the Latin dance community, around like bachata, merengue, zouk. If you go to a salsa festival in any given city in the US, you're going to see a lot of different types of people. Obviously, there's going to be, a lot of Latinx folks, but you're also going to see people from all kinds of walks of life and cultures, and they're going to be dancing together. They're going to be doing it in the street and despite ICE. And these events are happening all the time. And folks engaged in those spaces who are coming from, let's say, like a middle-class white background, you're an ambassador between different kinds of cultures. So to me, those kinds of spaces have tremendous revolutionary potential. And I think a lot of what we should be doing is carving those out, politicizing them, finding ways to cross-pollinate and to infuse the political vision into these cultural forms.
Just thinking through some of these convivial, it's something I've been coming to the conclusion on or kind of thinking of, but I feel like you're articulating, I feel like I'm getting increased clarity in my own thoughts from this conversation. And I think in the past, I played into the formalist democracy as procedure kind of framework.
Me too.
Too much.
Yeah.
And I've kind of been in the process of unlearning that through experience because of some of the weird games that people play with procedures.
Yeah.
And there's this constant search for, oh, well, there's something wrong with the procedure.
Mm-hmm.
Like we need to amend or change the procedures in a way that's going to prevent the strange cultural outcomes. And the cultural outcomes, sometimes I can see in my experience in organizing in various types of spaces, that what's really happening is that people are acting out for a need for connection that they're not having, and that participating in the wrestling match of a zero-sum victory, win or lose, or just trying to strike at the world to see the world flinch and know that they matter because no one has given them enough attention that they feel comfortable that their voice matters. It's like there's this ego game of I need to make my voice matter, and making my voice matter is disagreeing with someone and then having the attention on me and then being important. The same way that a toddler who's not getting enough attention will settle for negative attention if they don't feel loved and supported. And I've seen a lot of that over the years, and I've been kind of like processing how do you deal with that? And from you speaking, it kind of occurred for the first time, almost like what makes democracy work, regardless of the form, regardless of the rules. And I've known for a long time that education is part of it, because politics is comprised of information being rearranged in a collective way. And when you're trying to do that with someone who doesn't have the information, it can be really frustrating, especially when it mixes with that aforementioned acting out. But the acting out thing is the other component of functional democracy. Rather than a deliberative framework that is perfected, it's a sense of neighborliness, which is love. And like the convivial space, the social space, whether it's potluck dinners or going bowling or block parties with neighbors, and this could be the same for comrades in an organization or a community, is if you understand someone and you love them like a neighbor, and that you know that your relationship with them is going to persist, and there's some reasonable distance, but at the same time, there's a closeness in perpetuity imagined for the future. The education piece and the social life piece are reinforcing the information aspect of politics through education, and it's reinforcing the universal neighborly love component of politics, which means that people's needs will be met in a way where they won't feel the need to make themselves feel important by playing a strange game, which, I don't know, maybe it's too cynical a way to put it, but it's definitely a pattern I've noticed in various organizations.
Absolutely. I mean, I've now had a chance to talk to many different people about their experiences and perspectives on engaging in these kinds of movements. And that's been a real privilege. And this question comes up again and again, and exactly what you're describing, even the particular dynamic of people acting out and really feeling like they need attention to feel important, and that the assembly or the collective or whatever is the space to do that. That's a really persistent problem that we're experiencing. But I don't think it's a universal one in the sense of all human beings do this all the time, everywhere. Like that, I think, is not true. It's a particular response to this moment of capitalist alienation, which actually is part of why I take some issue with the notion of like the pragmatic critique of social ecology, because that sets up a opposition of pragmatism and utopianism, or pragmatism and optimism. And I think that that's in some ways the wrong approach, because it's not about balancing these sort of two different poles, but rather about trying to solve these problems that are social, emotional, and often psychological in nature for people, that mean that they are, and we are often locked in a place of immaturity. A psychologist listening to this conversation will tell you that's emotional immaturity, meaning that people are not reaching full adulthood. And many psychologists today will tell you that we're experiencing a society-wide epidemic of immaturity and inability to reach these critical levels of functioning. And that problem is getting worse. I do think it's a result of the encroaching line of, I'm being redundant, but the line of capitalist encroachment, right? We're seeing an capitalist enclosure of the psychic space. Like that's what social media is.
Yeah, where people come out the other end of a 55-minute reel hole where they lost all sense of time and they were exposed to all sorts of messages that disturbed them and that they didn't like. But at the same time, there's something about the attention grabbing. It was enough to make time a race. And at the end of it, you're embarrassed because you just wasted so much time. And you also are too embarrassed to share with someone that this happened to you. My God, I just spent an hour on TikTok and felt my brain drip out of my ears and I hated it. But yet I did it anyways. It's like your time is being sold for someone else's profit in that scenario.
Yeah.
You could imagine how for people who are growing up in this attention environment, how much more severe that might be, especially if I remember when I was a kid, my uncle criticizing the MSN Messenger sound that should be turned off on my computer so I don't get Pavlov's dogged into being obsessed with computers. I remember he told me this in like 2002 or something. He didn't use that terminology, but that was the gist. Yeah, he was right. And then also younger people are getting it like times 1,000, where there's like, yeah. So then that also contributes to the potential for emotional and social immaturity in how people relate to each other as well.
Yeah. Like I said, I've lately been thinking a lot about what are the democratic skills and capacities that we need to have in order to function in this kind of society. And again, we know that these kinds of politics work because we've seen them before, but we've mostly seen them function in other parts of the world than North America, than white colonized US North America. There's a relationship between colonization and the erosion of democratic skills. Democratic maybe isn't even the right word, but just these capacities to be able to live together. And I also think this speaks to your concern that it's very difficult for people to even imagine direct democracy. And for many people living in villages in Latin America, it's not difficult to imagine direct democracy at all because they practice it. And they might not have sovereignty relative to the state, but they can at least imagine it. And I think we struggle to imagine it in part because we've been subject to the erosion of our social skills and also our sense of belonging to a collective. Marx really describes capitalism as a social relation, right? It's an anti-social relation. It's the opposite of, how do I put this? There's this wonderful anthropologist named Marcel Mauss who writes about gift economies. And he describes capitalism and exchange as the ultimate antisocial relation, meaning that when we engage with someone in a gift economy, you feel a sense of debt or responsibility of the person who's given you something. You go to your neighbor, you ask to borrow their broom, and they lend you their broom. You feel a sense of reciprocity towards them, that you want to help them in the future. Maybe it's not by giving them a broom, but it's by helping them. And the gift economies function through that mechanism of paying it forward, whereas exchange-based economies, the active exchange eliminates the social tie. When you pay for the cup of coffee, you no longer owe anything. It's fair and square. The transaction is over, and also the social relationship is over. It's truncated. And so we've been living in this society where everything is based on the truncation of social relations, that our ability to have social relations at all is now really severely under threat. Look at the erosion of families and the inability for people to even live together in the same roof anymore. We're losing our ability to live together in a literal sense. And DoorDash and ChatGPT is thrilled because it means more money for them.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the time. It's a good point. I'm just thinking of, actually maybe I'll ask one more big question and then maybe we can wrap it up. But I'd be happy to do this again sometime and talk about more stuff. It's been great conversation. On the practical critique of social ecology framework or the alleged impracticality of social, it's typical for any utopian movement, right? It's like, well, it sounds good in theory, but how do you do it in practice, et cetera? But also having experienced some variations on direct democracy, like I think there are some genuine challenges that need to be overcome to make things work. But I think we're onto something here with the convivial glue of neighborly love. The other is also kind of a practical question, although it's much bigger and I think comes from a different place. But I've encountered a few people who have brought it up over the years, and I'm inclined to think there's some truth to it, which is when it comes to ecological transformation of society, the move from our current society, which is in a dystopian way, undercutting the natural world in a way that is going to make the long-term survival of humanity. In the best case scenario, much harder. In the worst case scenario, impossible. The warming of the planet is accelerating beyond the IPCC plans, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. I think it's 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries, something like that, we're in excess of. And there's a threat of things getting really bad with drought, weather, food shortages, etc. So there's a real urgency to the climate crisis, obviously. Social democracy is not in any particular position to address that, it seems. I don't see anyone with a big plan to address this in a way that feels within sight. But so to let social ecology off the hook for also maybe not having the exact silver bullet for the situation we find ourselves in. But when people imagine setting up, okay, community democracy, confederation, building towards a global political alternative that can transcend state and capitalism and replace it with a new society, that sounds good. But with the short timeline that we have, do we have the tools to shift the direction of the planet with these types of strategies? And in the most extreme version of this question, I guess, is like, do we have to utilize the power of, state-like institutions, multinational corporate power, or like the place where power is accumulated in the world unjustly in hierarchical ways? Do we need to use those levers in order to make the transition happen in a timely way? And if that is the case, or is partially the case, how can we use the values that animate social ecology as a guidepost for how we can do that, where we can create a transition, whether you call it a global Green New Deal or whatever variations people use. How do you do that according to, ethics, with responsibility to other people and the planet, and responsibility to other people in the context of domination, horizontalism, and so on? This is like an impossibly huge question, so I apologize for bringing it up, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on it.
Yes, my individual solution to the climate catastrophe and the
Yeah, just quickly, on behalf of social ecology, can you solve this problem in, I don't know, we have 10 minutes left?
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, I think some of the answer to your question is simple. First, the question of do we use the levers of governance, international NGOs, whatever, all the fucking schemes that are around, do we use those to try to save life on this planet? I think the answer is yes, we do. But who is we in that question, right? There's just human beings. Yes, we should, meaning they, the people who are in those institutions, everyone everywhere should be doing anything they can all the time to try to stop, mitigate, and avert whatever aspect of this disaster we can. A lot of it's not going to be avertable. Is that a word? Avertable?
It's not going to be possible to avert?
Yeah, avoidable. So I don't think that using those mechanisms is in moral opposition to seeding a popular democratic movement. Not everybody's going to have the time to do both, but I think it's important to, as a species, be working on all sides, right? We have institutions that currently exist, and then we have the institutions that we're trying to build. And people inhabit the current institutions who can play a role in using the existing power of those institutions to do some good or to carve out some space. At the Institute for Social Ecology, I was taught about a framework of resistance, reconstruction, and reform, right? We call this the 3 R's. So social ecology is not just a reconstruction project, right? We also need to be talking about resistance, and we also need to be talking about reform. These 3 things are not diametrically opposed to each other. We, again, meaning humanity, can be pursuing them simultaneously. And that a part of the democratic process, I think, is understanding how people who are existing in those kinds of institutions can participate in a democratic movement. So as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., who grew up here and is very close to a lot of folks who inhabit these kinds of institutions like NGOs, humanitarian groups, even certain areas of government, that many people in those institutions share a great deal of our values, more than we would think. Especially today, in this day and age, many of those people share our criticisms of capitalism. And they recognize that this particular way of organizing society is fundamentally broken, but they're choosing to exist in the system that we have. So instead of just dismissing people outright for having what we see as an incomplete answer, I think we need to be working with these people and bringing their expertise into our movements, bringing their power into our movements. We kind of, in some ways, have missed an opportunity with the dissolution of the federal workforce. I know people in the National Park Service who give a shit about social ecology, and those people are potentially on our team. I think we have to start looking to many different kinds of people and kinds of institutions as resources that we have to tap into. I think that anarchist left is reflexively very defensive and wants to recruit people to a very particular way of doing things. Again, this is a democratic reflex, right? To say, okay, well, how can we come together and come up with something new? What would it mean for social ecologists to reach out to school teachers on a really broad-based level, recruit school teachers in this political movement? And what would it mean for schools to be a locus of this movement? Schools are the beating heart of communities. Children go there, they're connected to parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Workers work there. Gymnasiums are natural places where people congregate for many different kinds of events, including assemblies. Schools are walking distance around neighborhoods. They're naturally decentralized, and they're naturally set up for the good of all. They're public institutions. So what would it look like to really recruit public servants in public schools into this movement, or libraries, for example? Granted, public schools and libraries don't have like a tremendous amount of control over, climate change, but I think we really have to look at anybody who gives a shit about life on this planet, gives a shit about civilization, who wants to see life continue. We need to be looking to those people as allies. And I don't know if some dumbass Facebook executive wants to give millions of dollars to a carbon sequestering project, and we're able to kick off a global movement towards carbon sequestering agriculture or decarbonization, and we managed to avert warming to 5 degrees Celsius. Great. If they get us 25 more years or 50 more years or 100 more years, it's more time to deal with this, because I agree, this question of time is really critical. And in my day-to-day life, I'm incredibly, I won't say pessimistic, but doom-oriented. I have this kind of schizophrenic existence right now of like defending direct democracy and defending these very utopian ideas in my intellectual work. And then when I go to bed and doom scroll, I'm like, shit, there's no way out of this. And I've talked to older social ecologists who've given up on the movement because they don't see a way out of this. They're like, we missed the boat. The moment is over. The window has closed. And I don't know, if you're old and retired, that's fine. But like at that point, or at this point, the only thing that really keeps us going is the fact that hope is a political principle. Hope isn't something that you get from the external conditions. Hope is a commitment that you make. And we're here because we have that commitment, right? Again, nobody fucking pays you to be a social ecologist. It sucks. Most people think you're dumb and laugh at you and say you're hopelessly idealistic. But it's not out of naivety that we believe in these politics. It's out of commitment to life on Earth. So I know we want to be mindful of the time, but those are just some of my thoughts. I also think that in practical terms, like what is it going to take to mitigate the effects of climate change, to adapt to our new reality and move to materially a kind of more sustainable society? I think the degrowth movement has really wonderful and important things to say about that, about decarbonization, about the reduction of waste. Folks in degrowth ecological economists have been crunching the numbers on what is it that we need to be doing, what are the deadlines that we need to reach. And then I think social ecology comes in as a natural complement and a political solution to, okay, we know that we need to achieve these tasks, decarbonize to this certain extent, reduce material waste by this certain extent, adapt to the fact that our planet is already changing in these given ways, then how do communities come together and respond? How do we plan together collectively in a way that's democratic for this transition? So there are no easy answers, but like you said earlier, it's not like anybody else is offering answers either. We have more answers than basically everybody else.
When you start answering something well, I found this as a general principle in politics, is the more that you explain, the more questions arise.
Absolutely.
It's a natural, like if you're willing to have no answer whatsoever, then the detailed questions that arise from trying to have an answer never appear. And it seems like it's simpler, but it's just because an idea sounds simple doesn't mean it's more effective, or just because it's easier to understand or comprehend or keep in your head as a single idea, like, oh, we're just going to get a really smart, strong guy to take it over for us and fix it.
Right.
It's appealing because, oh, it's such a small idea. It fits in your brain, even if you're busy. But the real answer to these questions is like, okay, well, we have to do like 500 things, and each of them has emergent secondary questions that need to be deliberated and worked through in real time. And it also requires a political context that we have to kind of theorize of even how to get there in the first place. So it's a real answer to a complex question is hard. And on the point you mentioned people who had lost hope, it occurred to me, for people who like committed revolutionary types who have lost hope because of how bleak things sometimes get, they don't see how their actions can resonate out in the world to have impact. And I think it's like a valid thing. But the remedy to that, I think, actually is the convivial stuff. If you're part of community, it's got to be fun enough that it's not all about winning in the end.
Right.
It's about the process as well. And having that neighborly connection with people too, I think naturally makes it easier to feel inspired and hopeful. And I don't know precisely who you're talking about. I know other people with similar positions. And I think there's types of loneliness that are not based on not being around anyone, but are also not being around people who are part of the same. Like you might be lonely in your ideas of how the world can change, even though you're surrounded by people. And that, I think, would foster hopelessness. So a convivial approach, I feel like, could help close that gap. But really interesting conversation. I've got other things to talk about, but we've, I think, gone on sufficiently for now. But I'd love to have you back sometime and just talk more social ecology stuff if you're up for it.
Yeah, I would love to.
Because there's lots. But yeah, so the book is Practicing Social Ecology by Eleanor Finley. You can find it at a bookstore near you, wherever you are, or you can find it on the internet or whatever for order. It's good. It's a good intro, something you can give to someone too if you want to introduce them to social ecology and give them a bunch of cool context. Before we go, any loose ends on our conversation? We weren't able to be exhaustive of every element of the world, unfortunately, but if there's anything that's hanging that you'd desperately like to include, I'll give you an opportunity before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think I want to add that the complexity of these questions and this tendency for answering some questions to lead to more questions, and it just seems to seem overwhelming. I want to add that that's why we need everyone. The complexity of these and the enormity of these questions is exactly why we need everyone to participate in building this new kind of society.
Yeah. So let's get everyone.
Yeah.
Let's all get together and have a party just to get started so we feel a bit of hope.
That'd be so nice, though, actually. Like, I guess some people wouldn't get invited.
Mm-hmm. Could you do a global party? Has that ever happened? Where people are like, okay, on February 18th, everyone around the world is invited to one big party. Host your own instance yourself, a decentralized global day of action for partying.
Day of party.
I think it could work.
That's what we should do. And I want to say instead of having a general strike, but maybe it should. I mean, I don't know if dare I speak the words general strike. I like the idea of a global party. I think you should do it.
Yeah, I feel like compared to general strike, it'd be easier to get buy-in because it doesn't involve making any sacrifices.
Yeah.
Or coordinating. But okay, well, yeah, thanks for being on the show. We'll talk again.
Yeah, this is great. Message me whenever you want to set up a time for something new or, to have another conversation. And thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
I appreciate it.